Welcome to a journey through time. Today we will immerse ourselves in the mists of the Scottish Highlands of 1689, where ancestral traditions intertwine with human destinies in a narrative that resonates to this day. This is the story of the Raven of Ballachulish, a man who learned that true strength does not reside only in muscles, but in the capacity to reinvent oneself when fate brings us down. Imagine a feared warrior who in mere seconds sees his entire identity crumble, a fall, a broken bone, and suddenly, he who was known as invincible needs to learn to walk again, not only physically, but in every aspect of life. What would you do if your entire world collapsed in a single moment? And you, who accompany us on this journey, from where do you watch us? Do the mountains touch your soul in the same way they touch mine? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Your company makes these stories even more special. Year 1689, Valley of Ballachulish, Scottish Highlands. The morning mists danced between the rocky peaks like phantoms of ancient stories, carrying in the icy wind the echoes of traditions that resisted time. In the Highlands, where every stone kept secrets and every stream whispered legends, Castle MacBride rose like a sleeping giant over the valley of Ballachulish. The claymore cut through the air with lethal precision that had made Hamish MacBride a legend among the Highland clans. His movements flowed like ancestral dance, each blow echoing the warrior wisdom passed from father to son through generations. The MacLeod enemies retreated before the controlled fury of the man who bore the symbol of the raven embroidered on his chest, the Raven of Ballachulish, terror of territorial disputes. The ambush had emerged like sudden storm among the grey rocks, 20 men against 5. But Hamish knew every stone of those lands, every curve of the terrain that his ancestors had defended with blood and honour. His grey stallion, companion of countless battles, responded to his commands like an extension of his own soul. It was when the enemy lance cut through the air, the cold iron found the horse's flank, which neighed in agony while its front legs sought support on treacherous ground. The world spun in slow motion, the grey sky, the sharp stones, the war cry interrupted mid-throat. Hamish felt the weight of destiny crashing upon his bones before even touching the ground. The crack was dry, definitive as a sentence. His left leg bent at an impossible angle, and white pain exploded through his body, rising up his spine until it clouded his vision. The MacLeods, perceiving the fall of the feared leader, withdrew quickly, not out of pity but superstition. In the Highlands, wounding a raven was considered bad omen. When his men found him, Hamish was conscious, but there was something broken in his eyes beyond the shattered bone. The pride that had always sustained him lay fragmented among the bloodied stones, and for the first time in his 32 years, the Raven of Ballachulish knew the bitter taste of vulnerability. 3 weeks later, he remained in his chambers, observing the carved black oak crutch that would now define his steps. Outside, autumn painted the mountains in tones of farewell, but Hamish could see no beauty in the world that had transformed into a prison. How could a man accustomed to flying learn to walk again? Lady Morag Campbell arrived at the castle one November morning, when the first snows began to dust the distant peaks. Her carriage crossed the stone courtyard with the solemnity of a funeral procession, and she descended from the vehicle with the rigid posture of one fulfilling an unpleasant duty. Betrothed to Hamish since she was 16, Morag carried on her shoulders the weight of an alliance between clans that would strengthen borders and guarantee peace in territorial disputes. She was a woman of cold beauty, shaped by the education of the lowlands, where warrior traditions had given way to court conventions. They met in the main hall, where a fireplace crackled trying to drive away the humidity that infiltrated through the ancient stones. Hamish leaned on his crutch, wounded pride more visible than any physical scar. Morag examined him with calculating eyes, evaluating each imperfection like a merchant inspecting damaged goods. "The years have been kind to you, my lord," she said, but the words sounded hollow as wind in an empty cavern. They walked through the castle corridors, she observing how he leaned on the black oak, how his steps echoed irregularly on the cold flagstones. Morag asked about his hunting abilities, his capacity to lead troops in battle, his aptitude for the responsibilities a laird must bear. Each question was a subtle blade, cutting what remained of Hamish's confidence. During dinner, served at the ancestral MacBride table, she spoke about conjugal duties, about the need for a husband who could protect and provide. Her words, though polite, carried the poison of rejection disguised as practical concern. The following morning, Morag departed without formal farewells. She only left a sealed letter on the oak table, her words written with the coldness of a commercial document. It spoke of practical impossibilities and responsibilities to her own clan. It mentioned his inability to fulfill conjugal duties with a diminished warrior. Hamish crumpled the letter between trembling fingers, but could not undo the knot that had formed in his throat. 12 years of betrothal undone in polite paragraphs, an entire lifetime of expectations reduced to diplomatic inconvenience. That night, he burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames devour the last connections to the man he had been before the fall. But could a letter burn also the dreams that a man carries in his chest? Chimey Stewart moved through the castle corridors like gentle breeze between heavy stones, her silent steps echoing an education in humility. She had arrived there 3 years before, orphaned at 17, carrying only a small leather bag with dried herbs, inheritance from her blacksmith father, who also knew the ancient secrets of mountain medicine. Her hands, calloused by honest work, knew the delicacy necessary to weave wool and the vigor to crush medicinal roots. In the castle, she had become indispensable not only for practical care, but for the way she carried the ancestral wisdom of Highland women, those who healed with plants, who prepared ointments under the full moon, who whispered ancient Celtic prayers while they worked. Steward Alien found her in the kitchen, preparing poultices for the wounds of men who had returned from the latest territorial dispute. His other servant girls had failed miserably in caring for the Laird. One fled at the slightest sign of bad humour, another shrank before the sombre silences that stretched through the chambers. "Kawimi," called Alien, his grave voice carrying decades of loyalty to the McBrides. "The Laird needs care that goes beyond the remedies of lowland physicians." She raised her eyes, where shone an understanding that transcended her 22 lived years. In the mountains, she had learned that certain types of pain did not reside only in the body, but took root in the soul, like tenacious ivy on ancient walls. She climbed the stone stairs, carrying a simple tray, a jar of salve prepared with mountain nettle, tea of herbs gathered at sunset, clean cloths soaked in spring water. Her brown hair, braided practically, swayed gently as she walked, and there was something in her posture that spoke of quiet strength, of deep roots. She knocked at the chamber door with delicacy, awaiting permission that took long minutes to come. When she entered, she found Hamish seated by the window, staring fixedly at mountains he could no longer roam freely. The oak crutch rested against the wall, and there was an air of defeat in his curved shoulders. "I brought something for the pain, my lord," she said, her voice soft but firm, without traces of the pity he so detested. Hamish turned, expecting to find another compassionate face, another pair of eyes full of sorrow. Instead, he saw serene determination, as if she understood that true dignity did not reside in ignoring pain, but in facing it with the right tools. Could it be possible that in the hands of a simple peasant dwelt the key to his redemption? The first days were a silent battle of wills. Hamish refused to accept Kawimi's care, preferring to drown the pain in generous doses of whiskey that left him numbed but not healed. She persisted with the patience of ancient stones, returning morning after morning with her potions and poultices, never allowing herself to be discouraged by hostile silences or harsh words. "Your herbs will not heal destroyed bones," he murmured, pushing away the salve jar with an impatient gesture. "No, my lord," Kawimi responded, calmly reorganizing her jars, "but they can heal what is wounded beyond the bones." She spoke of plants like old friends, telling how mountain nettle grew only where the soil had been blessed by storm rains, how valerian roots needed to be gathered under the light of the waxing moon to maintain their properties. Her stories carried the weight of traditions passed from mother to daughter, knowledge that survived invasions and the changes of times. Gradually, almost against his will, Hamish began to listen. She spoke of the ancient legends of the valley, of how the first McBrides had received the lands from a grateful druid, of how the raven symbol had been chosen not for the bird's ferocity, but for its intelligence and capacity for adaptation. "In ancient Celtic tradition," she said while applying warm ointment to his leg, "the raven is the bird of transformation. It does not die when wounded, but learns new ways to fly." The words were seeds planted in resentful soil, but Kawimi had the patience of seasons. She continued appearing with her steaming teas, her stories that smelled of peat and ancient prayers, her hands that worked without haste or anxiety. Little by little, Hamish realized he awaited her visits, not for the medicine, though the physical pain truly diminished under her care, but for the windows she opened to a world he had forgotten existed. A world where strength was not measured only by the sword, where ancient wisdom offered alternative paths for those willing to walk them. One afternoon, when she finished massaging his leg with wild eucalyptus oil, he delicately held her hand, examining the marks left by honest work. "From where do you come, Kawime?" he asked, pronouncing her Gaelic name with respectful care. "From the mountains, my lord. From the place where ancient stones still guard secrets, and where my father taught me that every wound carries within itself the possibility of healing." And in that moment, something long dormant began to awaken in the chest of the Raven of Balakulish. October had arrived with its colors of farewell, tinting the leaves gold and crimson, but Hamish remained locked in his chambers like a voluntary prisoner. Outside, the clan prepared for Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival that marked the passage to winter, when the veil between worlds became thinner and ancestors walked again among the living. The sound of bagpipes echoed through the courtyard, mixed with children's laughter and the aroma of oatcakes baking in the kitchens. It was a celebration the McBrides had maintained for centuries, honoring both Christian traditions and the more ancient Celtic memories that ran in their blood. Kawime found Hamish exactly where she expected, seated by the window, watching life happen without his participation. There was something different in his posture that day, a determination he had not seen before. She brought no tray with remedies, but simply sat in the chair facing him, hands crossed over her linen apron. "Nach math and fed hain a thig as a choir fain," she said in Gaelic, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "I don't understand," Hamish murmured, though something in his chest contracted upon hearing the ancestral tongue. "The best come out of their own difficulties," Kawime translated, her eyes fixed on his. "My father used to say that the strongest iron is that which passed through the hottest fire." She rose and walked to the wall where hung the McBride coat of arms, a black raven on golden field, with the Latin words Virtus et Honor engraved below. "Do you know why your ancestors chose the raven, my lord?" Hamish shook his head, expecting another of her lessons about ancient traditions. "In Celtic mythology, the raven is the bird of Morrigan, the goddess of war and transformation. It represents not only death but the rebirth that comes after it. The raven that survives winter is the one that learned to seek food where others cannot find it, that discovered new flights when the winds changed." She returned close to him, but this time there was no maternal gentleness in her gestures. There was challenge. "You bear the symbol, but do you honor its meaning? Or do you only hide behind it, like a child behind his mother's skirts?" The provocation hit squarely at Hamish's wounded pride. He rose abruptly, leaning on his crutch, his face flushed with indignation. "How dare you?" "I dare because I see a man drowning in self-pity when he should be discovering who he can be beyond the warrior he was," Kawime interrupted, her voice firm but not cruel. "Your clan celebrates Samhain down there, honoring ancestors and asking protection for winter. But their Laird hides like a ghost in his own life." The silence that followed was dense as mountain mist. Hamish looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not the gentle servant who brought remedies, but a woman who carried ancestral strength in every word, who was not intimidated by his position or his pain. "And what do you suggest I do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "That you go down to your people, that you prove to yourself that a raven can fly even with a wounded wing." In that moment, something beyond Hamish's leg began to heal. The descent down the castle's main staircase was a small victory that echoed throughout the hall. Hamish leaned on the black oak crutch, but there was new determination in his irregular steps. The Samhain festival was in full swing. Bonfires crackled in the courtyard, children ran disguised as ancestral spirits, and the aroma of spiced cider floated in the air like sacred incense. Kawime walked beside him, not as a servant, but as a guide who knew ancient paths. She had brought him a dark wool cloak embroidered with golden threads, work of her own hands during the long winter nights. The interlaced pattern followed ancestral Celtic designs, protections that Highland women sewed for their men before battles. "We will begin slowly," she said, leading him to a stone bench near the bonfires. "Your muscles forgot how to work together, but the body's memory is longer than the mind's." In the days that followed, Kawime developed an exercise regimen based on ancient Celtic warrior practices. It was not just physical strengthening, but reconnection with traditions that preceded Christianity's arrival in the Highlands. She took him to the standing stones that dotted the valley, megalithic monuments where his ancestors had meditated and sought spiritual strength. Ancient warriors knew that true power comes from balance between body, mind, and spirit, she explained while guiding him through slow, controlled movements. It's not just about moving muscles, but awakening the energy that flows through bloodlines. Hamish discovered that, although his left leg would never regain its former strength, other abilities could be developed. Kauimi taught him archery techniques that did not depend on perfect mobility, showing how Celtic archers used breathing and mental concentration to compensate for physical limitations. They spent hours in the training fields, she adjusting his posture, teaching him to distribute weight differently. There was strange intimacy in those moments, her hands guiding his, her voice whispering instructions near his ear, the warmth of her body when she approached to correct some movement. During the nights, they sat before the fireplace in his chambers, and Kauimi told stories of ancient Highland kings who had overcome adversities through wisdom rather than brute force. She spoke of Cu Chulainn, the Irish hero who fought with a fatal wound and still protected his territory, or of Fionn MacCumhaill, who gathered the Fianna not only through the sword, but through the capacity to inspire loyalty. True leadership, she said, her eyes reflecting the dancing light of flames, does not reside in the capacity to defeat enemies, but in the ability to unite allies. Gradually, Hamish began to understand that his identity need not be limited to the abilities he had lost. His clan's traditions were vaster and deeper than he had imagined, and for the first time since the fall, he began to glimpse a future worth building. Spring had arrived in the Highlands with its verdant awakening when Torquil MacLeod crossed the MacBride borders. He came accompanied by an impressive retinue, 20 mounted warriors and representatives of minor clans who observed power changes with calculating interest. Officially, he brought proposals for territorial negotiation. In reality, he came to test the strength of the wounded raven. Torquil was a tall, arrogant man with reddish hair that flamed in the sun and eyes cold as winter ice. He carried his claymore on his back with the confidence of one who had never known defeat, and spoke with the loud voice of one accustomed to being obeyed without question. The formal meeting occurred in the castle's main hall, decorated with ancient tapestries that told the story of MacBride victories. Hamish received the visitors seated in the ancestral chair of Laird's, the oak crutch discreetly propped at his right side. Kauimi remained at the back of the hall, among the other castle women, but her eyes did not leave Hamish. "I heard of your misfortunes," Torquil said, the word carefully chosen to wound. "A regrettable accident for a warrior of your reputation." The words were poisoned honey, courtesy that concealed contempt. Torquil spoke of new realities and adaptation needs, delicately suggesting that perhaps it was time to redefine borders between clans. After all, territories needed to be defended by capable hands. "I propose a demonstration," he said suddenly, interrupting formal negotiations. "A race to the sacred stone of the valley, as our ancestors did to resolve disputes. The winner defines the new territorial boundaries." It was an obvious trap, cruel as a well-sharpened blade. Everyone in the hall knew Hamish could not cover even half the distance to the ancient stone that marked the spiritual center of MacBride territory. To refuse would be to admit weakness publicly. To accept would be guaranteed humiliation. Hamish felt the weight of gazes upon him. His own men awaited his response. Representatives of minor clans evaluated his reaction, and there in the back, Kauimi watched him with an expression he could not decipher. "I accept," he said, his voice echoing through the hall like distant thunder. The race took place on a clear April morning. Half the valley gathered to witness the spectacle, some out of loyalty, others from morbid curiosity. Torquil removed his shirt, displaying muscles developed by years of constant training. Hamish kept his tunic but set aside his crutch, testing the weight on his injured leg. The signal was given. Torquil shot forward like a released arrow, his long, firm strides devouring the distance. Hamish managed only a few meters before pain exploded through his leg like red-hot iron. He stumbled, fell to his knees on the wet grass, and the sound of his fall echoed through the valley like hammer on anvil. Torquil did not stop to look back. He completed the race with ease, touching the sacred stone before returning, a triumphant smile stamped on his sweaty face. "It seems MacBride lands need new protection," he declared before the silent witnesses. "A leader who cannot traverse his own territory cannot defend it." While Hamish remained on his knees in the grass, humiliation burned more intensely than any physical pain. The humiliation of the race had spread through the Highlands like fire in dry heather. Other minor clans began questioning MacBride authority, and rumors of new alliances circulated among the valleys. Hamish returned to the isolation of his chambers, but this time not even Kauhimi could penetrate the wall of bitterness he had built around himself. It was then that the winter storm arrived with unexpected fury. The sky darkened on a November afternoon, and winds began howling among mountain peaks like maddened wolves. Snow fell in large flakes that quickly transformed into white walls, blocking passages between valleys. It was the type of storm the ancients called Breath of the Gods, merciless and transformative. On the third day of snowfall, news came that Alien brought with a grave face. A group of Macpherson shepherds had been trapped in the high hills with a flock of sheep. Among them was an entire family, including a small girl who had fallen gravely ill in the cutting cold. The clan's men gathered in the main hall, discussing rescue strategies that seemed more desperate each minute. Known paths were impassable, obvious routes blocked by avalanches. Some suggested waiting for the storm to pass, others proposed expeditions that would certainly result in more deaths. Kauhimi appeared at the hall door like a silent apparition. There was snow in her dark hair and iron determination in her eyes. "Where is your Laird?" she asked the group of men, her voice cutting through heated discussions. "My lady, with all respect," began one of the older warriors. "This is not a matter for women," she interrupted. "Then you prefer to let a child die in the mountains while men discuss routes they do not know." She climbed the stairs with determined steps, finding Hamish exactly where she expected, by the window, watching the storm as if he were responsible for it. "Your people are dying in the mountains," she said without preamble. "My men will find a solution," he responded without turning. "Your men are lost because they follow maps made by men who think like men. But mountains are not conquered by force, my lord. They are understood through wisdom." Kauhimi approached him, and for the first time since they had known each other there was urgency in her voice. "Do you know the ancient routes? The paths your grandfather used to hunt in storms? The trails druids traveled when they needed to reach stone circles even in the harshest winter?" Hamish finally turned toward her, something awakening in his eyes. "How do you know that?" "Because my father was not only a blacksmith," Kauhimi responded, approaching until she could feel the warmth of his breath. "He was guardian of the ancient ways, and taught me that ravens fly even in storms, my lord, especially in storms." And then, for a fraction of a second, she touched his face with fingers that trembled, not from cold, but from a love she could no longer hide. The silent confession that passed between them in that touch was like lightning cutting through darkness. Hamish covered Kauhimi's hand with his own, holding it against his face like an anchor in a storm. There were tears in his eyes, not of pain, but of something he had long forgotten how to feel, hope. "Help me," he whispered, and for the first time since the fall there was no shame in asking for aid. They descended together to the main hall, where men still debated impossible routes. Hamish entered leaning on his crutch, but there was something different in his posture, an authority that transcended physical limitations. "Silence," he said, and his voice carried the echo of generations of McBride Lairds. Kauhimi unrolled on the table an ancient map she had brought from her father's belongings, yellowed parchments that showed not only modern paths, but secret ways that ancient highland inhabitants had used for millennia. They were routes that skirted avalanches, caves that offered shelter, passages that remained traversable even in the worst storms. "We will divide into 3 groups," Hamish explained, his finger tracing lines on the map with surgical precision. "The first will follow through the southern ravine, using ropes that ancient hunters left fixed to the rocks. The second will circle through the valley, protected from the north wind. The third—" he paused, looking at his men. "The third will follow me through the most dangerous route, but also the fastest." "My lord," Aelian protested, my leg prevents me from running," Hamish interrupted, "but not from tracking. And I know these mountains better than any man in this hall." Kauhimi had prepared a special pack with remedies for the sick child, fever potions made with willow bark, ointments to protect against frostbite, teas that could keep a person awake and alert during the return journey. The expedition departed before dawn. Hamish led his group using knowledge he had forgotten he possessed: how to read snow signs to identify firm ground, how to recognize wind sounds indicating nearby caves, how to follow almost invisible tracks left by animals that knew safe paths. His crutch became an additional tool, testing ice firmness, serving as extra support on steep descents. Instead of hiding his limitation, Hamish transformed it into advantage, using it to lead with caution where others would have advanced recklessly. They found the Macpherson shepherds sheltering in a natural grotto, exhausted and desperate. The child, a girl perhaps 5 years old, was pale as the falling snow outside, her lips blue from fever consuming her small body. Hamish knelt beside the family, his large, calloused hands touching the child's forehead with unexpected gentleness. "Kaimi sent medicine," he said, removing flasks from the pack. "She knows the ancient cures. Your daughter will live." The return was a slow but triumphant procession. Smoke signals that Hamish ordered in the mountains, communication method Celts used before Roman arrival, guided other groups to safe meeting points. When they finally emerged from the storm, carrying the child wrapped in warm blankets and the saved shepherds, the entire castle awaited them, as if witnessing a miracle. The raven of Balakulish had learned to fly in a new way. News of the rescue spread through the highlands faster than spring snowmelt. The man who had fallen publicly before Torquil MacLeod had saved lives using ancestral wisdom where brute force would have failed. Minor clans that questioned his leadership began sending gifts, not from pity but from genuine respect. Imbolc arrived in February with its promise of renewal, the ancient Celtic feast celebrating Earth's awakening after winter sleep. It was traditionally a time of great decisions, when lairds made declarations that would shape their clan's future. Hamish convened an assembly in his main hall, but this time there was something ceremonial about the summons. He sent messengers to all allied clans, including a specific and formal invitation to Torquil MacLeod, not as enemy, but as necessary witness. Kaimi spent days preparing her own attire for the occasion, no longer the simple servant's garment, but a dark green wool dress embroidered with golden threads forming ancestral Celtic patterns. Her braids were adorned with golden ribbons, and she wore over her shoulders a cloak that had belonged to her mother, inheritance of the mountain healer women. On the night of assembly, the hall was illuminated by dozens of candles and torches, creating an atmosphere that evoked ancient druidic rituals. Tapestries with Celtic symbols decorated the walls, and in the center of the main table rested a silver chalice that had belonged to the first MacBrides. Hamish entered the hall without hiding his crutch, but bearing it as a symbol of honor. He had ordered new symbols carved into it, ravens in flight, Celtic knots representing eternity, runes speaking of wisdom conquered through suffering. "Brothers of the clans, friends and observers," he began, his gaze briefly meeting Torquil's, "I come before you on a sacred night to make declarations that will shape our future." He raised a sealed parchment, the original marriage contract with Lady Morag Campbell. "For 12 years I carried the weight of a commitment made for political convenience. Today, before witnesses of heaven and earth, I declare this commitment formally annulled." Lady Morag Campbell chose not to understand that MacBride's strength does not reside only in muscle, but in the capacity to adapt and grow. He burned the parchment in one of the torches, flames devouring years of imposed expectations. Then he extended his hand toward Cawim, who approached with the dignity of an ancestral queen. "Cawima Stewart," he said, his voice echoing through the silent hall, "daughter of the mountains, guardian of ancient wisdom, healer of body and soul. Before these witnesses, I declare my intention to unite with you through handfasting, the sacred union of our Celtic ancestors." A murmur swept through the hall. Handfasting was a tradition older than Christianity, a commitment that honored both love and spiritual partnership. "A woman who carries the wisdom of the ancients is worth more than all the gold of the lowlands," Hamish continued. "A woman who sees strength where others see weakness, who finds paths where others see only obstacles, who heals not only wounds of the body, but scars of the soul." Cawimi inclined her head with royal grace, publicly accepting not only the marriage proposal, but recognition of her worth before all Highland nobility. And in that moment, all understood they witnessed not only a marriage, but the birth of a new form of leadership. The handfasting ceremony was scheduled for the full moon of March, when ancestral energies would be most favorable, and Earth would truly begin awakening from winter sleep. Cawime and Hamish prepared for the ritual, following traditions that preceded Christianity's arrival in the Highlands, honoring customs their Celtic ancestors had practiced in immemorial times. The chosen place was the circle of ancient stones in the heart of the MacBride Valley, megalithic monuments erected by the first inhabitants of these lands, which still radiated primitive and sacred energy. The stones had witnessed thousands of unions throughout centuries, and their contours, blackened by time, seemed silent guardians blessing rituals performed in their shadow. Seamus MacPhairghuis, the last true druid of the Highlands, emerged from his retreat in the highest mountains to conduct the ceremony. He was a man ancient as the stones themselves, with white beards reaching his chest and blue eyes that seemed capable of seeing through time's veils. He carried with him a staff carved with symbols predating Latin writing. The ceremony began at sunset, when sky was tinged with gold and purple. Hamish arrived at the circle wearing the ancestral McBride tartan, not the modern pattern used in battles, but the original design only lairds had right to wear on sacred occasions. His crutch was wrapped in green and golden ribbons, transformed into ceremonial staff. Gawimi approached the circle carrying a crown of wild flowers gathered at dawn, purple heather, white daisies, and oak branches, symbols of protection, purity, and enduring strength. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders, and she had painted Celtic runes on her wrists with ink made from berries and sacred clay. The druid initiated the ceremony, invoking the four elements and sacred directions, his words in ancient Gaelic, resonating among stones like enchantment. He lit a bonfire in the circle's center using flint and steel, primitive method ensuring fire came directly from natural elements. "Let earth witness your union," he sang, scattering sacred earth around the couple's feet. "Let air carry your promises to ancestors. Let water purify your intentions. Let fire transform two souls into one." Hamish and Gawimi stood face to face in the circle's center, their hands bound by white linen cords, interwoven with golden threads, the literal hand-fasting that gave the ceremony its name. The cords were tied in knots, symbolizing specific commitments: fidelity, mutual protection, honor to ancestors, care for descendants. "By McBride blood and mountain wisdom," Hamish declared, his voice carrying echo of ancestral oaths, "I promise you protection not only of body, but of soul. I promise to honor your wisdom, value your strength, and walk beside you on paths the gods trace. By my father's memory and my lineage's traditions," Gawimi responded, her words flowing like ancient music. "I promise you healing for wounds of body and spirit. I promise to be your safe harbor in storms, your light in darkness, your companion in all life's seasons." The druid blessed the union with water from a sacred spring and burned herbs producing aromatic smoke. At the end, the couple jumped together over the bonfire, ritual symbolizing passage to new life, leaving the past in flames and emerging reborn. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, mixing Celtic traditions with clan festivities. Musicians played bagpipes and harps, storytellers recounted ancient legends, and warriors competed in games testing not only strength, but intelligence and skill. In the first year of marriage, Gawimi gave birth to Ruarid McBride, a dark-haired boy who carried in his gaze his father's determination and his mother's serene wisdom. 2 years later, Saoirse was born, a girl who came into the world with a raven-shaped birthmark on her right shoulder, sign the elders interpreted as special blessing from ancestors. The children grew hearing stories about how true love can heal wounds going far beyond the body, and how real strength manifests in the capacity to reinvent oneself when life demands transformation. 12 years had passed since the hand-fasting under ancient stones, and the valley of Ballachulish had flourished under Hamish McBride's renewed leadership. The man once known only for battle ferocity had become respected for a more subtle and lasting form of power, the capacity to unite, heal, and inspire. Castle McBride had transformed into something more than a military fortress. Gawimi established a traditional Highland medicine school in one of the towers, where young women from distant clans came to learn ancestral secrets of plant healing. Ancient recipes she had inherited from her father multiplied, being preserved in carefully illustrated parchments that would guarantee their survival through generations. Hamish developed a unique reputation among Highland lairds. He was the mediator others turned to when disputes needed resolution without bloodshed. His experience with pain and recovery had taught him patience, and his black oak crutch, now polished by use and adorned with small carvings marking diplomatic victories, had become symbol of leadership through wisdom. Ruarid, now 11 years old, showed interest in both warrior traditions and his mother's healing arts. Hamish taught him to handle sword and bow, but also to read nature's signs, to track wounded animals for healing, to resolve conflicts through words before resorting to weapons. "A true laird," Hamish told his son while they observed mountains from atop the walls, "must know when to fight and when to heal, when to be strong and when to be wise." Saoirse, at 9 years, already showed signs of inheriting maternal gift for medicine. Her small fingers were skilled at preparing simple poultices, and she had natural talent with wounded animals that appeared at the castle. The raven-shaped birthmark on her shoulder had darkened with age, becoming more defined, and clan elders whispered she would be an even more powerful healer than her mother. Hamish's own crutch had evolved over the years. Original carvings, symbols of pain and limitation, were being replaced by new designs telling the story of his transformation. Ravens in flight, Celtic knots representing eternity, small human figures symbolizing lives he had helped save or heal. On an autumn afternoon, when leaves painted the valley in shades of gold and red, news came that Torquil MacLeod had died in battle against lowland invaders. His son had assumed clan leadership, but sent emissaries seeking advice on how to negotiate peace instead of perpetuating ancient conflicts. Hamish received the emissaries in his hall, no longer as the wounded warrior who had been humiliated years before, but as the wise leader who chose his battles carefully. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had lost a race was now sought to teach others to find lasting victories. "Tell your young Laird," Hamish responded to the emissaries, "that a true raven need not prove its strength by attacking every bird it encounters. Sometimes the greatest victory lies in choosing to fly in formation rather than flying alone." Kauime, now a woman of 34, whose hair began showing first silver threads, observed these transformations with silent satisfaction of one who had planted seeds in fertile soil. Her medicine school attracted students from all Scotland, and her healing techniques had saved hundreds of lives over the years. On cold winter nights, when the family gathered around the ancestral fireplace, Hamish told the children ancient legends, but now included in his stories his own transformation, teaching them that true courage lies not in never falling, but in learning to rise differently. The legend of the Raven of Ballachulish had become something new, not only the story of a feared warrior, but the saga of a man who discovered that broken wings, when healed with love and wisdom, can carry to flights higher than he ever imagined possible. The winter of 1701 arrived earlier than expected, bringing not only snow and cutting winds, but also unexpected visitors. An elegant carriage crossed the valley of Ballachulish on a grey December afternoon, bearing coats of arms Hamish immediately recognised, the symbols of the lowland Campbells. Lady Morag Campbell descended from the vehicle with the same haughty posture of years past, but there was something different in her face, lines of bitterness that time had etched around her eyes, a rigidity speaking of destroyed dreams and unfulfilled expectations. She came accompanied only by a bodyguard and a maid, sign this was not an official visit. Hamish received her in the main hall, leaning on his oak crutch, no longer symbol of limitation, but staff of authority all in the Highlands had learned to respect. Saum remained at his side, not as silent servant, but as lady of the castle, her presence radiating serene dignity conquered through years of leadership and wisdom. "Lady Morag," said Hamish, slightly inclining his head in formal courtesy, "what unexpected honour to receive your visit." Morag looked around the hall, observing changes time had brought. Ancient war tapestries had been complemented by works celebrating arts of peace, embroideries telling stories of healings, paintings portraying Celtic festivals, symbols speaking of prosperity through wisdom. "Lord MacBride," she began, her voice carrying weight that had not existed in youth, "I come to request your help in a delicate matter." The story that unfolded in the following hours revealed destiny's bitter irony. Morag had married Lord Duncan Fraser, a wealthy lowland man who seemed to represent everything she desired: fortune, social position, and apparent physical strength. However, Duncan had revealed himself as domestic tyrant, man who used force to intimidate instead of protect. "He is not gentle," she said, words coming with difficulty, as if admitting weakness were betrayal to her own values. "Our children grow with fear, and I no longer know to whom to turn." The most shocking revelation came when she spoke of her eldest son, an 8-year-old boy who had developed mysterious illness that lowland physicians could not cure. The child was wasting away, losing weight and strength, and Morag had heard rumors about Kauimi's medicine school, about cures transcending traditional methods. "They say your wife possesses knowledge that can save my son," she confessed, finally looking directly at Kauimi. "I know I have no right to ask, considering my past choices." The silence that followed was dense as mountain mist. Kauime studied Morag's face. Seeing beyond superficial hauteur to recognize desperation of a mother, who had exhausted all other options. "Bring your son," said Kawime gently. "Every child deserves the chance to heal, regardless of adult errors." Morag collapsed in tears, not elegant tears of refined lady, but deep weeping of one who had carried too much pride too long. Hamish observed the scene with compassion that years before would have been impossible. Pain had taught him that true strength lay in the capacity to forgive, not only others but one's own lost illusions. "There is something more," said Morag through tears. "Something I should have said years ago, but was too proud to admit." She then revealed that her decision to break the betrothal had not been based only on Hamish's physical disability, but on fear of her own limitations. Raised to value only appearances and social conventions, she did not possess emotional courage necessary to face adversities beside a wounded companion. "You found a woman who possesses strength I lacked," she said, looking at Kawime with mixture of envy and respect. "And you became a leader I never could have inspired." In that moment, all past resentments dissolved, replaced by understanding that each path, however painful, can lead us exactly where we need to be. The arrival of Morag's son at Castle McBride marked beginning of a transformation that would resonate far beyond healing of a single child. The boy, fragile as wounded bird, was received by Kawime with all wisdom accumulated in years of studying ancestral traditions. His illness, she discovered, resulted from both nutritional deficiencies and emotional tension, ills that right plants and proper environment could cure. During weeks of treatment, Morag remained at the castle, observing not only her son's recovery, but also how a true family functioned. She saw Hamish playing with Laird and Saoirse in the courtyard, using his crutch to draw military strategies in dirt or lean while teaching archery techniques. She saw Kawime alternating between her responsibilities as healer and mother, never allowing one to eclipse the other. More importantly, she saw how a marriage based on genuine love and mutual respect created strength transcending any individual limitation. The moment of true revelation came on an afternoon when Hamish was teaching his son about future Laird responsibilities. Morag approached him in the herb garden Kawime had cultivated, where medicinal plants grew organized according to knowledge passed from generation to generation. "Hamish," she said, using his name without titles for the first time in years, "I need you to know the complete truth." The confession that followed revealed depths of her own fears and insecurities. Morag admitted her rejection had not been only about his wounded leg, but about her own terror of not being strong enough to companion a man facing real adversities. She had chosen Duncan Fraser's apparent ease because he represented a world where she would never be challenged to grow. "You frightened me," she confessed. "Not your weakness, but your strength. I knew instinctively that beside you I would be forced to become a better woman than I was capable of being at that time." Hamish listened in silence, finally understanding that some wounds from the past need to heal completely before we can see blessings they brought in disguise. When Morag's son recovered completely, she made a decision that surprised everyone. She returned to the lowlands not to submit again to tyrannical husband, but to confront him using courage lessons learned observing Hamish and Kawime. With her own clan's support, she managed to annul the marriage and establish independent life for herself and her children. Years later, she would send a letter telling she had become patron of a school for orphan girls, using her social position to teach young women that true strength comes from within, not from convenient marriages or maintained appearances. Hamish himself continued evolving as leader. His reputation as wise mediator spread throughout Scotland, and young lairds frequently made pilgrimages to Ballachulish to learn about leadership through compassion instead of intimidation. Kawime expanded her medicine school, establishing branches in other valleys, where her students carried ancestral knowledge to communities that had never had access to traditional cures. She herself became legendary figure, the Lady of Herbs of Ballachulish, whose hands could heal both body wounds and soul scars. Laird grew to become a leader, combining best qualities of father and mother, warrior when necessary, healer when possible, always wise enough to distinguish between the two moments. Saoirse developed healing powers surpassing even her mother's, and her raven-shaped birthmark became symbol of hope for all who suffered. She never married, dedicating her entire life to preserving and expanding ancestral medicinal knowledge. In spring of 1720, when Hamish had completed 63 years, he was found one morning seated peacefully under ancient stones where he had married Kawime. He had died in his sleep, serene smile on his face, oak crutch propped beside him as faithful companion of decades of walks. Kawimi lived 15 more years, caring for grandchildren and transmitting her final lessons to future generations. When she finally reunited with Hamish, the entire valley attended the funeral, not only McBride's, but representatives of dozens of clans touched by their wisdom and compassion. The legend of the Raven of Ballachulish survived through centuries, but transformed into something much deeper than story of wounded warrior. It became symbol of hope for all facing seemingly definitive falls, reminder that greatest victories frequently emerge from worst defeats, and that true love has power to heal wounds going far beyond what eyes can see. And still today, when morning mists dance among Scottish Highland peaks, the ancients say it is possible to hear echo of a voice whispering through winds. The wounded raven that learns to fly differently can reach heights it never would have discovered with intact wings.